Okay, so welcome everybody to this seminar in our series on Cuba. And tonight we have with us Professor Antoni Kapcia. For those of you who don't know Professor Kapcia, he is probably he is the most august and learned academic who has worked on Cuba in Britain, at the very least, and one of the most published on many aspects of Cuba and the revolution. He founded the Center for Research on Cuba, which thrives still at the University of Nottingham in 2004. And like I say, he is one of the leading experts on Cuba in the world. He's the author of far too many books that I can list. He's currently working on a historical dictionary of Cuba, and he's collaborating with Dr. Parkuma Swami at Nottingham on a project funded by the Leverhulme Trust, which is called Beyond Havana and the Nation, Peripheral Identities and Literary Culture. But tonight he's going to talk to us about Raúl Castro, and a very interesting and intriguing title it is. So without any further contribution from me, I hand over the screen to you, Tony. Please carry on.
Okay, many thanks for that. Thanks for saying some of the things I was going to say. So thanks for inviting me. Apologies for the fact that it's online. I actually had intended to come along, but basically a hernia operation took longer to heal than I had expected, and so I wasn't able to drive. But many thanks for arranging the online session, and to all of you for coming along to that as well. The topic was chosen actually partly between collaboration with Steve. Steve gave me some options that he knew that I've been working on, and I went for the Raúl Castro one, partly because I've given quite a few talks and written quite a few little blogs lately on that, but also because the last couple of books really, in a sense, shape the very way I'm going to look at Raúl Castro and the Cuban Revolution. I've defined myself as a contemporary historian. That's to say, contemporary history. I am not a political scientist. I say that from the start. What I've been working on is contemporary history, which I used to say glibly was politics without the theory. But actually, what it really is understanding the present through the recent past and vice versa, looking at the recent past from the present. So that's what I've been doing. So those are my credentials, and that's what I will do today, I hope. Now, what I should do, if it's worked perfectly, I should now be able to go to the screen. Can you see that?
Yes.
Good. Right. We're off in that case. So I will now go from the beginning and start with that. The title needs a little bit of explaining because in a way it does and it doesn't. The point is Raúl Castro needs to be understood because he hasn't been, even more, I think, in some respects than Fidel, because we knew Fidel for so long that all sorts of things were said about him, and in the end there was something of a consensus, maybe. On Raúl Castro there's no consensus. And also, I think it's worth at the same time, because I do think this is a prism for understanding the Cuban Revolution. You will note that I've put the term the Cuban Revolution in inverted commas. And that's because one of the essences of the misunderstandings that come about the revolution generally is that when we use the term, we generally mean what led up to 1959. We generally see it as the thing that happened. We talk about X number of years since the revolution. When the Cubans use the term, they mean what started in 1959, the process from then on. And we'll see in a few minutes that's relevant to what I'm going to talk about. So that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to start with some of the misconceptions and the challenges to understanding. The first simple one is access. And any of you researching on Cuba will recognize this straight away. It's not the easiest place to research on or in. getting the academic visa to research, which you by and large cannot research without. And for that, you have to have an institution inviting you. It's much more difficult than it used to be, but it also at times has been quite easy. But by and large, it's a difficult place to have access to. And also, one of the other reasons for doing history is not only my own training, it's also with history, you can get away with research in Cuba. With political science, you can't quite so easily. So access does affect the amount we know about Cuba. The second challenge is the preconceptions that we have. Now, everybody has preconceptions about a country that they haven't been to before. Forgivable. Where I think it's unforgivable is the media. And the preconceptions come very largely through the media treatment of Cuba over the years. It is mostly because the most media outlets do not have a permanent representative in Cuba. So the journalists and the broadcasters dip in, dip out. The prominent exception for that, my way of thinking, is the Reuters correspondent, Mark Frank, who actually is brilliant, but that's because he's lived in Cuba for decades. He knows it inside out. But the preconceptions are interesting as well, because in a way they date from the early 60s. They really do. The preconceptions that we have about a communist nation, about whatever it is we're judging Cuba as before we get there, and the journalists always do that, those preconceptions were created in the early 60s during the Cold War. And of course, what happens is they arrive in Cuba with those preconceptions, they see the things that confirm the preconceptions and go away and write about it or broadcast it. But they haven't seen the things that don't fit the preconception. So it's a very one-dimensional approach. The next challenge is one that we all, anybody who works on Cuba knows about, the politicization of the literature. It is a highly politicized topic, understandably, because the Cuban Revolution divided opinion on the island and outside right from the start. And of course, what happened very quickly was that there was a very large number, 700,000 Cubans left Cuba just after, in the first 10 to 15 years, mostly going to the United States, most of those going to Florida, and most of those ending up in Miami. And it created a community, an emigre community. And I use the emigre deliberately because although eventually it became more emigrant, it is an emigre community, which was remarkably coherent and remarkably cohesive and remarkably ossified. They took their reasons for leaving with them, and that shaped the views of that community. Now, I happen to know all this in personal, very personally, because one of my postgrads is a Cuban American from Miami who came here to do research because he wanted to research outside the Miami bubble. He recognized there were some things he couldn't look at in Miami. The material's there, but he couldn't talk about it. So the politicization has really created a very particular way of looking at Cuba in the United States, not only in government, but there are areas of the literature on Cuba in the United States that are dominated by Cuban Americans. Now, it doesn't mean they're wrong, but it means that they are shaped by that background. There is, incidentally, of course, a politicization on the other side, nothing like as big, but that is what I call the solidarity literature, which also dates from the early 60s in to a great extent. And it's much easier to spot than the politicization from the emigre community, but both of them have the tendency to simplify. And of course, one of the things I always say about Cuba is the most profound thing you can say is it's always more complex than you think. It is. Cuba is as complex as any other country and potentially more complex. So those are the challenges. The other challenge is the images, and that will bring me in a second to Raúl Castro, because he is one of the people about whom the images are really important. Images, of course, frame those preconceptions and reflect those preconceptions, so they are important. And I start with this image, which has nothing to do with Raúl Castro. It's so familiar that, and there was another one which I couldn't find, which was a travel company, which had the same thing, an American car, and it talked about Cuba, not the country that time forgot, but country in a time warp. Well, Yeah, okay. Cuba's in the 2021 in a very big way. The people I think in the time warp are the one with those preconceptions. That's the problem. And so if you use those images to represent Cuba, you are missing a lot. Right, let's now go on to Raúl then. I think Raúl's images, I've reduced them to three images, which I think explain a lot. The first is that one. Raúl, military uniform. Actually, the hat looks a little bit like a Soviet military hat as well, standing next to the Soviet leader with Fidel next to him in battle fatigues, in guerrilla fatigues. You've got the differences between them then on the face of it. And that image, all that picture image reflects the general image that was very, very common for a long time, which was Raúl, the hardliner, the military man, the inflexible military man, and the Marxist, the absolutely hidebound Marxist, the hardliner. He was always perceived as the one who was the real tough guy behind the scenes. Now that dates actually from 1953, from middle of 1953, not that picture, but the image, because Raúl, when he was a young student, did join the youth movement of the then Communist Party, the PSP, People's Socialist Party, and then headed off to Vienna to a youth congress. And while he was there, he visited a couple of countries in the socialist bloc, came back to Cuba, was detained immediately by the authorities because of his stamps in his passport, and released. Now that was fine, except he was on file, and that file found its way to the American intelligence in the embassy. And in 1958, when the embassy was desperately trying to find out the politics of the rebels up in the Sierra and in all the cities, they found their red under the bed. The reds under the bed were there. And this is the Cold War, of course. So that's what you were looking for. One red, of course, was Che Guevara, except they never pinned him down. They couldn't work him out because he didn't seem to belong to anybody, any organization. And that made them more suspicious of him. But with Raúl, they knew he had been a young communist, therefore he was a communist. And when he then, after they came to power, proceeded to, along with lots of other government members, go along to visit the Soviet Union, visit the socialist bloc, and start talking to the Soviet military, have very close connections with the Soviet military, that confirmed that image. He became the Rasputin figure. He became the person who was really controlling behind the scenes, really designing that shift towards the Soviet Union. So it's a long history, that model, that image that we have. That's one. The second one is that, a little bit like the image that's behind Steve in his house, wherever. And that's the kid brother, the younger brother behind Fidel. And that, in a way, is one of the ones that's really interesting, because it does date very largely from the mid 2000s. It doesn't date before that very much. It's in 2006, 2007, 2008, when Raúl became interim president while Fidel was being operated on and then in recovery of some sort. And then, of course, when he was elected leader by the National Assembly. And the assumption was that because he wasn't Fidel, he was, to use the words of the Bush administration, Fidel light. Kid brother. In other words, he was only vice president, senior vice president, and therefore interim president, because he was his kid brother. It was a dynastic assumption about Cuba. It was applying our readings of North Korea, which may or may not be true, and applying them to Cuba, coming back to the preconceptions. And Fidel light was the assumption. And of course, that reflected a view very, very common. And I know that Bill Leograndi will know this very clearly, that the common assumption in a lot of policymaking circles was that it was all about Fidel. Fidel was controlling. The whole thing was being held together after the collapse of the Soviet Union and before by Fidel. And I know that I have this from someone that who knows about the military in the United States. who said that actually there was a contingency plan to prepare for the death of Fidel in office, which was that there would assume to be a huge rush of emigrants, refugees, fleeing to the American mainland because of the unrest and the bloodshed in Cuba after the death, because the whole thing was held together by Fidel. And Raúl couldn't hold it together. Well, that is the complete opposite, of course, as the first image, very obviously, because the first image says he was pulling the strings. The second one says actually he didn't pull any strings at all. He really was not at the patch on Fidel. The third one is that one, which is Raúl the Reformer. Now, I'll start with on this one with an anecdote. In 2007, early 2007, I remember being in someone's house in Havana, chatting to them, and suddenly the neighbor called out and shouted, "Fidel's on television." And it was the first time he'd been seen on television after his illness and operation. And that had spread all sorts of rumors that he was dead, that something was happening to him or whatever. So both of them went to watch the television, came in, and I started asking them about their reactions. What was clear was they mixed relief that Fidel was alive and okay, not dead. That was a basic affection. There was also relief that he wasn't well enough to come back into power, into the reins of office. Because what had happened, and people of all over Cuba were noticing that the previous few years, he had in many respects, Fidel had in many respects shown that he was aging, he was losing it. I remember being at a couple of speeches where he clearly lost his thread. And others remembered when he forgot numbers. Others remembered, of course, when he fell over. So the image that he was not in a good fit state to run Cuba was worrying Cubans. They knew that he would be succeeded by the vice president, Raúl, and they knew, first of all, he was one of the historic leaders, therefore he could be trusted. But secondly, he was a reformer. And they knew he was a reformer because when the Soviet Union collapsed and Cuba was plunged into economic mayhem within just a couple of months, the drive to recover from that, the unprecedented process of reform which began in 1992, was very largely spearheaded by Raúl. He was the one that persuaded Fidel to accept things he would never have accepted before, allowing the dollar to circulate freely, allowing self-employment again, breaking up the state lands, and so on. Those were things that Raúl persuaded Fidel to accept in order to save the revolution. And people in Cuba knew that. And they also remembered that in the 1970s, he'd been associated with a period of what was called institutionalization, because that was when the revolution seemed to slow down, seemed to resemble the Soviet Union a lot more. Some of the structures that began in the 1970s really were based, to some extent at least, and sometimes very much, on socialist bloc and Soviet models. And that happened, but at the same time, people got better rewards in the 1970s than they had in the 1960s. And that was clearly very much driven by Raúl's preferences. Now, that's interesting because there's another image. I'm not going to give you an image to this, but I'm going to talk about misconceptions. That picture is also representing another misconception, because when those two met and when they signed the agreements to set up embassies and to fully recognize each other, the assumption broadly was, A, that really was the new relationship between Cuba and the United States, because since 1961 there had been no relationship. And the second was that the embargo was also ending at the same time. Well, the first one wasn't strictly true, because it was Jimmy Carter that mended the relationship, first of all, in 1997. Because he set up the interest sections. There was partial recognition, and he set up the interest sections in each other's capital. And the interest sections are now the embassies. In other words, same building, same size of building. And it really was the interest section for some time was treated as a full embassy, but it did not have the authority of an embassy. There were other factors to it as well. So in a sense, Obama simply upgraded, but it made a difference. But what it didn't make a difference to was the embargo, because the misconception is that the embargo ended and it didn't. He didn't end the embargo, partly because he couldn't. And this is a real principal one here, because the 1996 Helms-Burton legislation passed by those two unforgettable Congress people changed the status of the embargo, because it made the embargo repealable only by 2/3 majority of both houses of Congress. The chances of that happening are slim, to say the least. It also, incidentally, the legislation around it stipulated that it could not be repealed as long as a Castro was in power. In other words, personalizing it, and without really clearly defining what power meant. So Obama couldn't have done it. He could, of course, have done it by presidential decree, but couldn't necessarily have proceeded with that. I wonder, though, whether he didn't necessarily want to repeal the embargo. And the reason I say that is because I know that to some extent, although others who are listening maybe can correct me on that, he was advised by people who had worked with the Clinton administration to set up the so-called twin track policy. The twin track policy was keep the embargo, but don't enforce it quite so vigorously, but undermine the system from within by having contacts with civil society, educational, cultural, sporting, whatever contacts, undermine the system. It was a more sophisticated version of what Reagan had done in Eastern Europe, with trying to undermine with contacts with civil society. So in a sense, ending the embargo, although it was the public face of the détente, because Obama criticized it quite clearly, but at the same time, he didn't want to, perhaps. He did try to set in motion a momentum to undermine it by his presidential decrees about banks backing their cards in Cuba and IT companies investigating opportunities in Cuba. There was another one which was also to restore remittances, the amount of remittances that could be sent back to their old level before the Bush administration. That was the only one that was actually acted on. The other two were not. And the reason they were not is because the banks and the IT companies were worried about being hit by the US Treasury. In other words, the embargo was still there. In fact, during Obama's presidency, two big banks, ING and Barclays, were heavily penalized for breaching the embargo, even though were not American banks. So in other words, it was unsuccessful. But does it really matter? Does the fact that the embargo is still there really matter? Well, the answer is yes, very much now. Because if you look at the evolution of the embargo, you will see that it's actually become more and less important depending on what's going on in the world. I think for the first decade or so, it was important because it helped lock Cuba into that Soviet-led world, into the socialist, not the socialist bloc actually, but into the Soviet-led world, into a very limited economic relationship with that world. And at the time, although the rest of Europe did continue to trade and recognize, there wasn't much trade worth talking about. And Latin America was mostly, apart from Mexico and in the Americas, Canada, was locked into the embargo as well. So it really was effective then in one respect. It mattered much less once Cuba joined Comecon, the trading network of the socialist bloc. And by that, at that time, same stage, also relations with Latin America changed dramatically. The Nixon administration actually was the one that allowed Latin American countries to start trading with Cuba and start recognizing Cuba. And that made a big difference. So the embargo mattered much, much less until 1990, when in 1991, it became the crucial element, because by that stage, there was no Comecon, there was no Eastern European markets. And besides that, in 1992 and 1996, as we've seen, the embargo was tightened twice. So it became even more important than it was before, tightened again under Bush in 2004, and spectacularly so under Trump. The figure normally given for the Trump administration is that he decreed 243 separate measures to tighten the embargo in his 4 years. Unless my maths are wrong, it's 2 a week. That is just phenomenal. Sometimes they were small measures, sometimes they were much bigger ones. And in particular, he allowed the Helms-Burton Act to be enacted fully. And that really did make a difference because it had an enormous depressing effect on investment in Cuba, commercial operations in Cuba, and so on. So yes, it mattered. I was in Cuba in 2018 when some of those measures came into effect, and you could see visibly the difference it made to supplies of food imports, and some of the scarcities of today actually began again in 2018. That's when they started. So Trump made a difference, no question. I think broadly, in terms of the embargo, Carter was the only one really to make a big difference because he allowed the travel, he stopped enforcing the embargo quite as effectively as it had been. And I think Clinton and Obama both had what I call the twin track policies, because Obama didn't call it that, but I think it was. What's it all about? Why is it so important? Well, that's really interesting, and I'm going to go whizzing through this and then come back to Raúl. The justification has changed substantially over the years. Initially, it was specifically because US enterprises had not been sufficiently compensated. That's what it was about. So in 1960, it wasn't the embargo, it was simply flat sanctions. In 1961, it was because communism was deemed unacceptable by the Organization of American States Charter. And at the same time, of course, with the close links with the Soviet Union, Cuba was perceived as a threat to US security. I say until October 1962, because remember, one of the outcomes of the missile crisis was that it was clear that the Soviet Union was not going to the limit to defend Cuba. It really wasn't. The threat disappeared then in many respects. And that's when the embargo, I think, became much more important as the other way of dealing with Cuba. Then, of course, for a long period, Cuba was a threat to US interests in Latin America because initially of the very active and open encouragement of guerrilla warfare throughout the continent, that clearly was a threat. And then in the 1980s, it was Reagan who actually talked about Cuba being the source of the unrest in Central America, in Nicaragua, in El Salvador, and so on, and in the Caribbean, not least in Grenada. So the justification was shifting all the time, depending on what the main imperatives were for foreign policy towards Cuba. 1990s, it became human rights. Under Trump, it was used very openly because it was justified because of Cuba's support for Maduro in Venezuela. You can see it's just changing constantly, whatever it meant in the first place. And by the way, remember that the embargo was effected formally in 1963 under the 1917 Trading with the Enemy Act, which means every time the embargo is kept in place, Cuba's the enemy. The Cubans interpret that as the reality as well. So that really is quite important. What really matters? Well, who knows? Let's not leave that for another time. But I never forget the importance of Florida in all presidential and congressional elections. The existence and the power of that lobby and that that solid voting bloc in Miami and in Florida generally of the Cuban American community makes a difference. I only mention the year 2000 as proof of that. And I think that although there are other times when elections have not swung on Florida, you really don't want to antagonize the Florida electorate if you're seeking election. So it continues to play a role. I'm not saying it's the main reason now by any means, but it's a pretty important one. Right, let's go back to Raúl. What can we say about him? Right, first thing, yes, he was a Marxist before Fidel, no doubt. Not only did he read Marx before Fidel, he joined a Marxist party. He left the Marxist Party very quickly, by the way, because that Marxist Party, the Communist Party, the PSP, criticized the attack on the Moncada barracks in 1953. And that was one thing that the next step in this process worth looking at, because the Moncada attack was plotted by Fidel and a very small group of people in one of the parties, the Ortodoxo Party in Cuba. And the attack on the 26th of July 1953 on the barracks was designed to seize weapons and then start guerrilla warfare in the Sierra Maestra. Raúl was not part of the planning, so he wasn't a key player at all. That's partly because he was actually in Europe at the time. But when he came back and was told by Fidel of the attack, he immediately joined. That was significant because he could not be a member of the PSP still, or the Juventud Socialista, the young socialist youth wing, and join the Moncada attack. So it is almost certain, we don't know yet when he did that, but at some stage he was either expelled or he left the party. So he was still a Marxist, he still had the same views, but he nonetheless was joining the Moncada attack. In the attack, he didn't have a senior role at all. He was second in command of a very small contingent that occupied the nearby hospital. So he clearly wasn't in the leadership, but then he began to move up the ranks. He went to prison with the others who survived and were arrested. In prison, he rose up through the ranks and became much more significant, not least because of his political nous. In Mexico, when they left in 1955 to prepare an expedition to Cuba, in Mexico he showed himself to be very astute and militarily very apt as well. And once they landed in December 1956 near the Sierra and then started on in the Sierra, he became really a key person in the whole process. So by 1958, he was clearly one of the three leaders, and behind Steve, if you can see Steve's picture there, there was the three leaders. He was one of the three, which is precisely why in 2007 Cubans were prepared to accept him as president, because he was the only one standing, literally, and therefore it was logical that he should be one of the three leaders. In 1959 he became defense minister and retained that post all the way through till he became president, till he became interim president. So his hard line image, which is related to that, of course, carried on. In reality, of course, as we know, it's something else. And in 1976, only in 1976, did he become senior vice president. That's the year also that Fidel became president. So his nomination as interim president, and therefore when he was elected permanent president or 5-year president in 2008, it was absolutely logical. And it was logical that he assumed power, and it was logical that he would be elected. There is a logic to all this, no surprise there. I do remember all the speculation in the press when Fidel was taken ill in 2006, who's going to succeed him? And some bizarre people were offered. I remember in the press, in the American press particularly, I knew that because I was in the United States at the time. But the one that no one ever thought of particularly was the logical one. It was bound to be Raúl. Cubans knew that. Anybody working on Cuba knew that. Who else would it be? Right, that does bring up the question of his relationship, because still looking at that picture behind Steve, there's a lot of rumor about the relationship between Fidel and Che, about them falling out. I still think there is almost no evidence of that at all, that Che left for other reasons. But his relationship with Raúl, was it just older brother and kid brother? And the answer is no, I don't think it was. I see them very clearly sharing the same long-term project, and I'll come back to what that project is in a minute. They always differed over how to achieve it. They are different personalities, and they differ in their preferences for how to achieve it and what works and what doesn't work. And I think that's clear for those years, all the way through almost the 3 decades. It was very clear that Fidel was the person who favored what I call passionate mobilization. I take the notion of passion from Damian Fernandez, who talked about the politics of passion, I think he is right. But mobilization is clearly what Fidel liked. He liked attacking problems head on, mobilizing people to solve a problem immediately in not necessarily the most efficient fashion, but often the most effective fashion. He didn't actually very much like parties, the political party. He didn't, sometimes the party got in the way, sometimes it was a nuisance. Raúl, on the other hand, always preferred structures, systems, efficiency, and accountability. I mention the accountability because look at structures and efficiency. He comes across as the systems man, as the arch bureaucrat. But he actually is not a bureaucrat because he really hated inefficiency. He wanted efficiency and efficient operation. But he also always saw that, and presumably still does, the party as a guarantee of accountability. And if you didn't have regular congresses and regular meetings, then you couldn't have accountability. You had no method of controlling the leadership and controlling the representatives further up the system. So there was very clear difference in approach. But one thing that comes over very clearly is that in 1986, there was a process which didn't last very long because of what happened subsequently, of what was called rectification. It's that wonderfully named that only the Cubans could come up with, rectification of past errors and negative tendencies. It just rolls off the tongue. But rectification meant ending the problems of the previous period. And they both, although they had different views about that previous period, about whether it was necessary or not, they shared the same perception that something needed to be done in 1986 for different reasons and in different ways, but they shared the need. And that's because they shared the same set of principles that they thought were necessary to save then in 1986 and in 1991. And in 2008, one of the things he did was interesting. When he was elected, he was obviously stung by the criticism that he was going to reform the revolution out of existence and be the Gorbachev of Cuba. What he said straight away is, I have not been elected to destroy the revolution. I have been elected in order to save the revolution and by modernizing it and updating it. That's what he was going to do. But that was the best way he felt to destroy it. Now, I mentioned the project. What was that project? Well, I think that's it. And I'm sorry if you've heard me talk about this before, but I bang on about this. I think it was always about nation building, long overdue. So you can go to sleep during this little slide if you want, where I just briefly talk about the history of it. But the history is important here because nation building didn't happen in Cuba in the 1820s, when it theoretically started to happen elsewhere in Spanish America, when they got their independence. Because in Cuba, the criollos, and I use the term criollo deliberately rather than Creole, because Creole in English can mean other things than what it means here. At the time, criollo were whites born in the colonies. So the whites born in Cuba preferred the safety of Spanish rule and the benefits of Spanish rule. Spain would keep the slave trade going and would protect the whites against the slaves. So they preferred to stay Spanish rather than be independent and vulnerable to either the United States or Britain. So they stayed. They stayed when others didn't. The next logical time for nation building was when Cuba got independence. Except remember, they got independence in 1902, not from Spain, but from the United States, which of course had turned the Cuban War of Independence into the Spanish-American War, followed by an occupation of 3.5 to 4 years. And what followed was openly neo-colonial rule. The Platt Amendment, which I'm not going to talk about, you're spared that one, but the Platt Amendment guaranteed the neo-colonial rule in Cuba, very closely linked, incidentally, to Britain's protectorate in Egypt, which happened before, and the Americans clearly learned from that, about how to do that, how to control Cuba without having troops. In 1934 was another opportunity for nation building, when a nationalist revolution, which failed, nonetheless did create a slightly different structure of republic, because the Platt Amendment had gone, but nonetheless Cuba was still under very close US economic and political hegemony, quite clearly. Not the same structurally, but quite clearly. And I think the proof of that, incidentally, is it was the National Bank, which had been arguing for since independence, was only created in 1950. And one of the reasons why it didn't come earlier is that successive American administrations did not want a Cuban national bank. So that was a little illustration of how it was still there. So the question of everybody in 1958 was, yes, we want nation building, but how? And most of the rebel, I say all the rebel leaders agreed, I think they all did, but not everybody further down the movement agreed, but they wanted some form of socialism. And I use it in inverted commas, because if you know anything about socialism in the 1950s, there were any number of varieties of socialism. And any number of parties in Cuba had at some stage called themselves socialist. Even Fulgencio Batista called himself socialist at one stage. So it was a term that had no sort of evident consensus meaning, but nonetheless was there as common parlance. So the key question was, what form of socialism? Well, we know all this, by the way, because I think it's interesting. I'm not going to do that, don't worry. Look at the 1940 Constitution. Why the 1940 Constitution? Well, because that's the basis of what happened afterwards. It was a very interesting mix of nationalist and socialist proposals. The two forces that dominated the assembly that wrote the Constitution were both nationalist and socialist, and sometimes both. And the document is important because it informed the program that Fidel drafted in 1953. History will absolve me. If you look at the program that he said we will introduce, it was very closely based on what was stipulated in the Constitution but had not been enacted, and remarkably close to the reforms that in those first 3 years. If you look at the reforms that took place in those first 3 years, including not holding elections, by the way, it's remarkably close to what was said in 1953, and that was remarkably close to the 1940 Constitution, which was very clearly a nation-building constitution. And it was nation-building because it was trying to replace the one that had the Platt Amendment in it. And so it really was, we can't have nation building unless we have a constitution that does this, that builds a more equal and a more independent nation. And that's what they were trying to do in 1958. So what kind of socialism did they adopt? Well, essentially, US hostility forced them towards one form particularly. In 1961, it's interesting, the so-called Declaration of Socialism was not a declaration of socialism. I always describe it as a passing mention of it in a speech, when he said, what they can't forgive us is we're trying to create a socialist revolution under their noses. No one really batted an eyelid in the audience when he said it was a socialist revolution. You talk to people who were there in the crowd at the time, they knew it was socialist already. So it wasn't a declaration of what was going on, it was confirmation of it. But the US hostility did force them to that one form, which was the Soviet form and the socialist bloc form. But let's not forget that throughout the decolonizing world in 1940s, 50s and 60s, the USSR was widely seen as a model for nation building, radical nation building. Another model, incidentally, was Attlee's Britain as well, how to reconstruct a nation after the war. And therefore, socialism in the decolonizing world was a very common part of discourse. Even the Indian constitution included a definition of socialism, of India being a socialist state. In addition to that, Soviet support persuaded the rebels, as did the Communist Party. The PSP support persuaded the rebels that actually, yes, socialist bloc socialism probably is what they should go for. But it pushed Cuba into the Cold War and it narrowed the ideological choices a little bit. However, if you follow what happened, I'm not going to go into the details of this, the years 62 to 68, I think it goes beyond that as well. You saw the leaders, particularly Fidel and Che until 1965, leading an increasingly radical and maverick version of socialism, which completely challenged the orthodox theories about whether it could be socialist or not. The Soviet Union had one view, the Cuban leadership had another, and certainly whether Cuba could be communist. So they were trying to define their own kind of socialism. What then followed was what I mentioned of institutionalization, when it slowed down and returned Cuba to some sort of orthodoxy, which, as I said, seemed to copy Soviet models. But interestingly, that only lasted 11 years. Rectification ended that, because in rectification they started to go back to earlier models or earlier ideas. And then, of course, came Armageddon. 1989, the collapse of Eastern Europe, the collapse of Comecon, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that forced a rethink. Very rapid rethink, that one I mentioned. How can we save the revolution? 1991 was the party congress, one of the few party congresses to happen on time up to that point, which showed you there was great consensus. How can we save the revolution? Well, what was saved was indeed by that unprecedented set of reform proposals. But what followed was another debate. Well, what have we saved? Because saving the revolution had a lot of costs. Things like the dollar, allowing the dollar to circulate freely, allowing tourism to become the staple of basis of the economy. Those were double-edged. So what have we saved and what should we save? Essentially what the debate was what do we mean by the revolution? It was a long and very public debate. I think it's still going on, actually. And it was, for example, it was public debate, it was by consultations, it was in newspapers, it was in magazines, it was in research centres. The debate was going on. What do we mean by it? And I think three options came up. One is that the original project of nation building through something called socialism. The only question is what kind. And the Cold War then limited the options. The second option is 1962 to 1970, the heroic revolution. Namely, when the really attractive revolution started to develop, attractive to the outside world at least. And then there was another version, which was the golden age of 1975 to 85, when things worked, when Cuba was probably more equal than it had ever been, when goods were delivered, when people got more money for working harder and so on. Those were the three options. You could almost identify which elements of the leadership went for which option. Not least, Fidel probably accepted the second one more instinctively. Raúl clearly preferred the first. And in 2008, when he talked of not destroying the revolution, but modernizing, he used the term actualizar, bring it up to date. He meant that original project, but with a new kind of socialism. And he began to talk of Cuba being in transition to socialism, not being socialist, but in transition. And the new constitution in 2019 uses that term. So it's really interesting that it's gone back to that 1959 to 61. And what happened in meantime, while this was all going on, is that the revolution's discourse returned openly to patria and nación, homeland and nation, which you heard from in all areas and in culture particularly, as much as you heard socialismo and much more than you heard comunismo and Marxismo-Leninismo. Public discourse stopped using those terms quite so frequently, and they were clearly replaced by patria, patria, nación, nación. And indeed, in the new constitution, Marxismo-Leninismo has been replaced by Marxismo, comma, Leninismo, comma. So was that just pragmatic rhetoric? Yes and no. Yes, it was. They were appealing to the patriotism, but at the same time, it did reflect what most Cubans thought then in 1959, what they still thought, and what Raúl wanted. So where does it leave us with Raúl? Clearly a key player in the whole process, working alongside and in tandem with Fidel for the same project all along, imposing his own approach when possible in the 1970s, and then in 1991. So he was no Fidel light, but he also showed something about the revolution by having challenges. He did not run the show himself. He launched a series of public consultations on change, fiercely criticizing. He sounded like Thatcher at times in those critiques of what was wrong with the revolution, and then encouraged people to voice their criticism at the same time. And his promise to bring it up to date meant that he really had to fight for authority in the party. He didn't have his own way at all. He wanted a party congress in 2008 and didn't get it till 2011. He had to negotiate his way through the whole reform process, which is, I think, why the reforms were as slow as they were, as quick as they were, because he was the one leading them. In other words, he actually clearly is the person who imposed the process of reform. And I'm going to stop with that. And that's it. I think he clearly is important, without any shadow of a doubt. Whether he succeeded or not is another matter, but we can leave that to discussion maybe. And I will now close my sharing. I think, have I done that? Yes, I have.
Yes, you have. You have.
So
We're back
over to you, folks. And Imti, you're okay to go at 6:15 still. So I did keep it to Raúl time rather than Fidel time.
No, that's tremendous. Thank you so much, Tony. A lot to think about and a lot to consider in that. I've got one or two questions myself, but I'm going to open the floor up, and if people want to ask a question, you can use either the chat function or you can put your hand up using the hand function to signal that you wish to speak, and I'll come to you. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands straight away, Tony. I was interested in your periodization, particularly the periodization of the American justification for their policy, because, you know, I agree, you clearly showed that the United States has altered its reasons for having the embargo at different times, which actually then leads you to suppose, well, there's got to be another reason for it. Yep. A lot of people say, well, what the hell is that policy about? I wonder if you could give us your view on what you think the real intention is.
I think for a long time, Cuba policy didn't really matter to the United States. I think that's the point. After 1962, I think Cuba was on the back burner. It was not a problem. It became a problem when you wanted it to be, for rhetoric purposes, and you always had the embargo to rely on. So you could tighten it, you could loosen it, you could tighten it, you could loosen it. But it was under Reagan that Florida's electoral importance and the importance of the Cuba lobby became even greater. And I think that's when it started to assume a domestic importance. Not always. I know Obama was convinced. They'd done surveys in Florida and realized that they could probably lose Florida but still win the election. But nonetheless, it's a dangerous strategy. You need to be sure that at least Florida's not going to be the crucial one. So I still think that's the case. And of course, what happened twice was that there was an assumption that Cuba was also ready to collapse anyway. So if you just turn the noose, tighten the noose a little bit more in the early 90s, it's going to collapse. Well, it didn't. And I think that is almost certainly what happened under Trump, that you turn it a little bit more and it's going to collapse. What none of them knew, of course, no one could have predicted Trump, let's face it, but no one could have predicted COVID either. And I'm quite sure that now one of the reasons why people in the audience may correct me on this, but one of the reasons why Biden will not ease the embargo is because Cuba's really on its uppers now. It really is in great difficulty, and a little bit of tightening might actually bring some change. So it comes and goes, I think.
I mean, my take from that, Tony, is that really underlying it is a desire for the regime change. And
yeah, no question. Yeah. Well, right. Obama said that.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. William Kelleher asks, how close was Raúl to Che?
I think he was much closer than people realize. He was the one, after all, who introduced Che to Fidel, who met him first, introduced him to Fidel, and they often saw eye to eye. They were both clearly Marxist. They had different interpretations of Marxism. I don't think Raúl was ever a Gramscian, whereas Che was. And I think they differed about their preferred approaches to all sorts of things. But if we're talking hardliners, actually, in many respects, Che was much more of a hardliner than Raúl was. I always remember asking in a focus group, asking people to, I was asking them to compare the importance of Jose Marti with Che Guevara. Asking them one question at the end of it when they'd all relaxed. I said, okay, if you had an opportunity to spend a weekend with either Jose Marti or Che Guevara, who would you pick? And they just did not know who to choose at all, because how could you choose between them? But one young woman came out straight away and said, Marti, no question. And they all laughed. Why? She said, because Che would make me work every hour. I would be exhausted by the end of it. So we're talking hardliner. Actually, instinctively, they were much closer than you might expect.
Yeah. Good point. Al Campbell has got his hand up. Al, you want to ask a question? You're on mute, Al. We still can't hear you, I'm afraid. Okay. What you just said, Tony, while Al's sorting his microphone out, reminded me of a story that the photographer Alberto Corda told me about the day he went to photograph Che driving the first mechanical cane cutter they designed. And he had to go out to the plantation to do the photography, and Che made him work for 3 days cutting cane before he'd let him photograph him.
Yes. It looks like Al has just left in order to come back again. So
yeah. Okay. Anybody else got a question that they'd like to ask? No. Well, I've got a couple of points that occurred to me during the talk, which I thought were interesting. Okay, I've got one from Paul. He says, "Hi Anthony, thanks very much for your insights. You clearly show that the perception of Raúl as a dynastic rather than natural or logical successor is wrong. He is now 90 years old. Who are the people likely to take up the leading role in the continuing revolution, or is the conflict or chaos previously predicted more likely on his demise?"
Right. Okay. I'll take that as a question. Right.
Yeah, well, it is a question. Is chaos?
Yeah, this is where I could easily have a cop out and say I'm a historian. I look backwards rather than forwards, except that my record on predictions is actually not bad. So maybe I'll stick my neck out. I always knew that Raúl clearly was going to hold things together. That was no doubt about that. It is interesting that until, of course, Trump started to tighten the embargo, and until COVID, it did look as though Miguel Díaz-Canel, who was very clearly a Raúl protege, no question, he's gone up through the ranks as an efficient operator. I also knew the person who was his political advisor, who really spoke very highly of him. And so he was clearly reliable, sharp, is a listener. And I think, therefore, he was a very good person, a very good choice to lead. But none of them could have predicted what's happened. None of them could predict the bottom coming out of the Cuban economy as tourism closed off because of COVID. And none of them could have predicted 243 measures from Trump. So those two alone are a problem. And the other thing, of course, which has caused a real problem has been the fusion of the two currencies, because that always was necessary. And it's one of the things that Raúl promised and didn't deliver on because he couldn't. Well, in many respects, Díaz-Canel couldn't, but he had to, because the economy was in such dire straits that you might as well do it now rather than just leave it and put it off. But there's a cost to that. The fusion of the two currencies has made some people poorer. And I'm quite sure that the unrest which we've seen is partly fueled by that. The ones who are really feeling the pinch are the ones who have lost out in that fusion of the currencies. So my prediction is that I don't know. I really don't know how it's going to go. It is everybody, when I always say, well, Cuba's always at a crossroads. Of course it is. any revolution's at a crossroads, and any primary sector dependent economy is at a crossroads. But Cuba is at a bigger crossroads than as it has been since 1991, I think. I still think there's enough going for it in the system to survive, because it's still very much about nation building, and the force of the participatory networks are still working remarkably well. But none of us equally could have quite predicted the impact of social media as well, the impact of the internet. So you put all those things together, it really is a perfect storm. So the answer is I don't know. So I'm going to stop making predictions now. My guess is it will probably survive, but I have a much easier job of trying to guess who the next Norwich manager is in football. So it happens to be my team. So
Al, have you managed to sort your microphone out? You're on mute still, Al. You're on mute, Al. Oh, you're still silent. If you want to ask a question, Al, I suggest you type it into the chat. Well, Tony, one thing that you said, of course, I mean, one of the other factors, I think, is this, the old Rossenow idea of rising expectations. I was struck by the fact that if you go to Havana now, there are all these magnificently built huge hotels in central Havana, which were all built in this period when there was this opening under Obama to accommodate American tourists. And the American tourists never came.
Yep.
And so there was this kind of rising expectation of improvement, which was generated by that Obama opening. And then the sudden shutting of the door, creates that dissolution, if you like. And of course, in real terms, much of the Cuban economy became dependent on tourism, meaning that people's livelihoods were built around tourism. And, COVID ended that income. And at the same time, Trump imposed new sanctions which stopped family members making it possible for them to send money to their family. So you have a large section of the population that had lived really quite well because they managed to make a living from, the tourism. Suddenly their incomes dry up. And so you've got a pool of people that have suffered an enormous downturn in their living standards. So all of those things, as you say, do create a kind of perfect storm, don't they?
I think so. And I think the ones who really suffered from that were not just the investors who built the hotels. Part of me that thinks, well, more fool you. But the people who opened Paladares, the people who saw that there was an opportunity at the lower level. And those are the ones receiving remittances before. They'd kept those remittances. They now were investing in modernizing places, setting things up for the tourist market. And as you say, it didn't happen on the scale that it was expected to. In fact, the only significant tourist arrivals from the United States were mostly Cuban Americans who went to their families anyway, rather than to the Paladares. And therefore, they're the ones who suffered. And I think they're the ones who are suffering more now after the fusion of the currencies than the ones who relied on the Cuban peso. So it is really there's a very significant population, and they are concentrated in Havana. They really are concentrated in Havana, Matanzas, one or two tourist areas, Holguín, for example. Yes, they're concentrated there, which is why you get unrest in some of those places. But you go to Bayamo, you don't get the same unrest there because it didn't have the same kind of economy. So, yeah.
That is interesting. And I think I may be wrong, but I don't think there were very large disturbances in July the 11th in Santiago de Cuba.
No.
Which is kind of, when you think about the geography of the event, it's interesting, isn't it? And I was on a call yesterday with Ada Ferrer, who's written this I think, very good history of Cuba, just recently published. I don't know if you read it. But she was saying that she felt that there was a possibility of civil war. I'm not convinced that that's true, but I don't think that might happen. But potentially there are geographic areas where the revolution is more solid than in other places, so there could be, some kind of geographic factionalism develop. I don't know. Al, are you with us now?
I don't know. Can you hear me now?
Yes, you are.
Oh,
Yes.
Hey, found the right mic. Let me be real brief. First of all, it's just a fantastic talk, Tony. It's really, we expected it from you, but nevertheless, it was fantastic. It was so rich, and every point brought up the nuances that were connected to it were just, I thought, really spot on. I wanted to say three things, and since I can't disagree with you, which I'd like to do, I'm going to have to just reinforce things that you actually said. So one is on domestic politics, and that's real quick in the United States. And you mentioned the voting bloc in Florida, and of course the Democrats did slightly worse than they thought, and that caused Biden to switch. And that's all true. But I would also say, and this points exactly to something you also said, it's also the fact that Florida's domestic politics, not just because of which way the state goes, but because, well, since 1980, when the Cuban National Foundation started funding people, like Helms Burton. Burton was from Indiana, and he got 50% of his money from the Cuban community, and there's no Cubans in Indiana. But Biden isn't really very concerned with Cuba, but he is concerned with his domestic agenda. And there's two aspects to that. Number one, he only has 50 people in. If he loses one vote in the Senate, he doesn't get his domestic thing. And Torricelli is in his party. And so we don't know exactly what Torricelli's demanding, but we can be sure that he's demanding something as far as trade-offs on the Cuba thing. And the other thing is that, Marco Rubio, of course, is in the other party. But nevertheless, Biden's people have to make agreements with Marco Rubio because, as such a high person in the Foreign Relations Committee, as well as the Senate Intelligence Committee, the Biden people can't carry through their stuff without getting certain agreements with Rubio. So there's trade-off there. So it's exactly the fact that it is domestic politics, but it's not just the voters. It's also the split in the United States between the Democrats and the Republicans, a little bit like before the Civil War, but we won't go into that. Okay, the second thing I just wanted to say was on the importance of the blockade, which some people are really, even longtime defenders of Cuba are downplaying that and pointing to errors that the Cuban government is making. And the Cuban government certainly makes errors and has for a long time. But there's really very little the Cuban government could do. They went down 11% last year. If they did everything right, they might have gone down 10%, The blockade is just essential. These are numbers. They imported $12 billion in dollars of goods. And of that, 65% were intermediate goods. Their whole production, any small country, Belgium, Switzerland, they have to buy inputs and sell their outputs. It's not like China or Russia that has a continental economy that can just, move things from one part to another and keep it in their own country. If they're cut off from trade, they're cut off from production. And that's what happened at the beginning of the 90s when Comecon collapsed, just exactly as you said. And that's why that's why the embargo was less important from 72 to 90 or something like that, exactly because they were integrated into a larger economy. No small country can possibly do anything unless they can be part of a larger economy. And all the other small countries of the world can do that, just be part of the world capitalist economy. And that's blocked from Cuba. And we saw that in the beginning of the 1990s when the way Cuba finally turned around its drop was exactly to be able to start getting trade around tourism, investment, and resumption of trade. And that's when they were able to turn it around. And that can't happen right now because the blockade is actually even more severe than it was then. So the blockade, I don't want to excuse what the Cuban government does wrong. They make errors, et cetera, et cetera. But right now, the blockade is more important than it's ever been. And then the last thing, which you said, but I just wanted to really enforce that with numbers. Like I say, 2018, 65% of their imports were intermediate goods for production. An additional 15% were capital goods. They only imported of their total import bill, only 20% was consumer goods. It's not that they can't import in order to eat. They can't produce because they can't import. And the last thing I'll just say is on the dual currency, because in the street in Cuba, as you know right now, that's what really is upsetting people, the inflation that's taken off. And that has to do with the monetary exchange rate and salary reforms, which all took place at the beginning of the year. And so a lot of people just say, gee, they shouldn't have done it right now because, they don't have the reserves. Any country carrying out those things needs background reserves, which normally you can borrow from people. But again, the blockade stops Cuba from doing that. But the point is, it's sort of what you said. I criticize the Cuban government not for doing it now. They absolutely had to do it now. I criticize them for not doing it 5 years ago.
Yes.
Now, as you said, Raúl had troubles carrying it out because he didn't have complete control. But it should have been done 5 years ago. It was brought up 10 years ago, and then they dragged on and they dragged on and they dragged on. Now, 5 years ago, they didn't know COVID was coming, and they didn't know the Obama openings were going to turn into a disastrous closing. And so you can say all that. But having done that in politics, I mean, when you have the opportunity, 5 years ago, they were in a lot better shape. If they had carried it out, the effects of doing that back then would have been, and that's the error that the government made. There was reasons for it. It's understandable, but that's the error. But they had to do it today. They can't even understand what's going on in their own economy if they don't carry out those reforms.
Okay, yeah, good. Thanks for that, Al. What's interesting is that a couple of things in what you said there. I said at one point, didn't I, that by and large, for long periods, the embargo and Cuba policy doesn't matter.
Yes.
And I think that is the case at the moment. It doesn't matter to the Biden administration. Really, It really doesn't.
No.
I've forgotten the other point I was going to make. It was the last thing you were talking about. It'll come back to me. Blame senility. Sorry about that.
The dual currency stuff?
Oh, yeah, it was the mistakes.
Yeah,
it is actually possible. I've done it myself as an exercise to go through all of the key decisions that were being taken over the years to say, could an alternative decision have been taken? And most of the decisions actually, of course, could have been different.
Yep.
But given the circumstances, given the ideological drivers, given the nature of the system, in most cases, I would exaggerate a bit and say 9 cases out of 10, the decision they took was the only one possible in the circumstances. So it was wrong, but it was only proved wrong in the end because things didn't work out.
And I agree with that. I agree with that. And I would say, in addition, that most of those, the wrong decisions they make, and they were wrong, didn't make a big difference.
Yeah.
The really big differences occurred from things like, were they allowed to insert themselves into international trade when they had to, which was the only way that they can really get their economy to take off. They have foreign direct investment, which is only 10%, whereas everyone else in Latin America has 20%. And they have to fight like hell to get that 10%. If they could get 20%, they could take off. That's not allowed. Trade's not allowed. Do they make internal errors? Yes. Agriculture being one of the big ones, but those are really they have to be understood to be secondary errors.
Yeah. I think in one of his candid moments when he was asked how come you managed to survive, the revolution survived, Fidel actually said, well, we made thankfully only tactical errors and not strategic ones. Yeah. There is a question in the chat from Michelle. It says, Cuba's foreign minister just had a press conference where he denounced a propaganda machinery set in motion for the 15th of November in order to depict Cuba in the online world as a failed state, regardless of what is happening in the real world. And that is the date when Cuba is reopening its borders and welcoming back international tourism and reopening and trying to revive the economy after the hardest months of the pandemic. Have you any comments on that?
Well, the most obvious comment is yes. The notion of a failed state is, I think it's nonsense. I mean, if Cuba was a failed state, people would actually not be eating. They would be doing other things. They would be, even in 1991, 2, 3, 4, it wasn't a failed state. And that was when the state was at its weakest, but it still functioned. And it functioned because the participatory systems took the place of the state. They actually operated at the grassroots. And to some extent, that is what's happening at the moment. So failed state is just simply a rhetorical definition. And I still don't know what a failed state actually is. A failed state is one that collapses, where I can't think of any. Well, we're probably as much of a failed state at the moment in the way that we're dealing with COVID. So no, it's not a failed state. It may not be the state that people want, but it's not a failed state. And of course, it is interesting that the demonstrations and the protests, whether they're driven by outside or inside, have chosen the date of the protests as the date when the economy opens up. I'm not quite sure what that means, but it is in a way significant, because it's just the point when suddenly the money will start flowing, and the money will start flowing because some of those dollars will be brought in and will start flowing immediately. Quite what that means is anybody's guess, but I would have thought actually that probably most people would be much more interested in getting access to those dollars rather than going out and throwing bricks on the street.
Yeah, yeah.
I may be wrong.
I mean, Tony, if I could add something to what you just said, which I completely agree with, the date is significant in two reasons, and we didn't mention this when we talked about our perfect storm, although you did refer to it, COVID. The date is possible only because Cuba has managed to bring down and defeat this wave of the Delta variant that also took off in January when Biden took over. So through this whole period, Cuba has been battling with this outbreak of the Delta variant, which has been, well, relatively speaking, I have to say, devastating. I mean, even now, if you compare the incident figures, death figures, and so on with per capita with Britain, for example, they've done really much better than Britain has in dealing with it. But they've actually developed their own vaccines, and they look like they've defeated the pandemic or the epidemic in Cuba through their own efforts. I mean, with some assistance, of course, from outside in terms of people donating and countries helping out, but nevertheless, more or less, under this very difficult conditions, they've got through this. So, in fact, if the attempt to destabilize and then create a situation which would overthrow the system is to work, it's got to work now, because if Cuba opens up and the tourists return, then this storm is over, isn't it?
It is, and I think there's one other element incidentally on the perfect storm, which I didn't mention. You've got COVID, you've got Trump, you've got the fusion of the currency. You've also got the fact that every time there's been a previous outburst of unrest, they've been a siphoning off process. People have been allowed to leave for the United States or wherever. That option is not available now. And that really makes a difference, because sometimes that has managed to siphon off the opposition, siphon off the unrest, siphon off some of the people who perhaps you didn't necessarily want to be there anyway. But that's not going to happen this time, precisely because the United States is now more difficult to get into for Cubans as well than it's ever been. So, yes.
Al, you want to come back?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something real quickly again. You know, when we think about what could Cuba do to turn its economy right now, there's actually something real simple and straightforward if there wasn't the blockade. Again, 2018, the earnings from selling medical services overseas were twice the tourism or things. So this tourism has collapsed everywhere around the world, including in Cuba. The losses, this is a product which Cuba provides to the world at quality, at low price, at a time when the world needs it desperately. And it sells twice as much as tourism. What they could have gained during the pandemic selling medical services could well have completely offset the tourism losses. And that would have made, you know, Cuba's situation today absolutely, you know, phenomenal. And they now have 3 vaccines ready, 2 more in the pipeline. they could be selling vaccines all around the world, even at reduced prices to help other people in the world. They have the products that they could sell to turn this thing around quite quickly if the blockade was lifted.
Mm. Yep. Right. Well, anybody else got any questions they'd like to ask before we sign off? It's just coming up to 6:30, which is really the time we would designate. An hour and a half is the time. Tony, I want to say a really big thanks to you again for doing this. It's been a tremendous discussion, and your talk will be preserved online thanks to YouTube. I'll be posting it in the next few hours or day or so when I get a moment, and we really appreciate it. So
many thanks to you for organising, and thanks to everybody for being there as well.
Great. I'm going to stop the recording, and we can